Hey guys, tonight we're diving straight into one of those moments in history where, honestly, you probably wouldn't survive. Sorry to break it to you. The mid-13th century weren't exactly cosy blanket weather, unless you count a damp wool cloak that smells faintly of sheep and smoke. This was the age when the Black Death swept across Europe, snuffing out entire villages, cramming plague pits with bodies, and leaving behind a silence so thick you could hear your own heart hammering in your ears. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what city are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice when you step into a town right after the worst of the plague isn't just emptiness, it's the smell. Streets are strangely still, but that lingering odour of lime, ash, and something much heavier clings to the air. People had tried to cleanse the cities with fire, with herbs, even with vinegar splashed across doors, but you can't hide the memory of thousands of lost souls. Wooden shutters hang crooked, half-chewed loaves of bread sit fossilised on abandoned tables. Cats roam freely, fat from the endless buffet of forgotten grain stores and, let's be real, the occasional rat. You wander further, passing rows of houses where only one or two flickering candles remind you that someone inside has made it through. It's unnerving. Imagine knowing that 2/3 of your neighbours are gone, and the few survivors eye you with suspicion, like maybe you're carrying the next invisible wave of doom. Whole streets sound hollow. Even the gossip, Europe's favourite pastime, is hushed. Here's the historical fact. By the early 1350s, in some places like Florence, up to 60% of the population was gone. Entire professions collapsed, entire lineages vanished, and chroniclers wrote about fields going unploughed, mills standing idle, and bells tolling until the ropes snapped from overuse. But here's the quirky bit. Some chroniclers also swore that wild animals started taking back the land. Wolves supposedly prowled closer to Paris than ever before, daring to test the boundaries of the city because, well, fewer humans meant less resistance. Wolves weren't the only ones. Rumours swirled of pigs living like kings in abandoned villages. Imagine a medieval pig rave. Free barns, no rent, unlimited scraps. Of course, not everyone agrees on how accurate those animal invasion stories are. That's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Some argue the tales were exaggerated to dramatise just how empty towns felt, like writing a spooky campfire story about how civilization was dissolving. Others think there might be a grain of truth, that ecological balance really did tilt for a generation, though maybe not quite as dramatically as wolves roaming Paris. Still, the idea fits the eerie quiet you're imagining, a Europe that felt suddenly, terrifyingly wild. And the silence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Survivors carried this invisible weight, as if laughter had become an endangered sound. Priests struggled to comfort the living because, honestly, most people had watched their prayers fail in real time. Neighbours avoided one another's eyes, and in the spaces between the hushed footsteps, you might catch faint echoes of chanting processions, those penitents who whipped themselves bloody in public squares, convinced that their sacrifice could stop the plague. By now, most had faded away, but their memory lingered in the fear-soaked air. What's strange is that survival itself almost felt suspicious. Imagine standing on your doorstep with your family still intact while the house next door is nothing but shuttered windows and silence. Did people envy you? Did they assume you'd made a deal with forces beyond the church? Stories of witches, of hidden healers, of mysterious blessed families started to circulate, blending superstition with bitterness. Survival wasn't just luck, it was political. It changed how neighbours trusted or distrusted one another for years. And walking down those empty cobblestone lanes, you can sense the start of something new. Survivors weren't just grieving, they were calculating. Behind shuttered windows, people were already tallying land, inheritance, and opportunity. Every empty house was both a tombstone and a potential windfall. Society had cracked, but inside that silence, you can feel the gears of human ambition starting to grind forward again. The silence of the streets wasn't just the end of something. It was the seedbed for what came next. And tomorrow, or next week, or whenever the survivors mustered courage, the rebuilding would begin. For now, though, you just keep walking, every step echoing in a town that feels more like a haunted stage than a living community. The silence of the streets doesn't last long. Soon enough, the quiet is broken by the dull scrape of shovels and the groan of wooden carts, their wheels sinking into mud. You follow the sound, and it leads you to the edge of town where fresh earth piles high. This is where the survivors spend most of their days now, digging, dragging and covering. Graves stretch in rows like open mouths, some shallow and hurried, others marked with crosses fashioned from whatever scraps of wood are left. You watch as figures wrapped in patched cloaks heave another body onto a cart, their faces hardened not just by grief, but by the sheer monotony of death. After a while, mourning turns into labour, and labour turns into silence. The historical record tells us that graveyards overflowed so quickly during the height of the plague that entire fields were converted into burial grounds. Chroniclers describe bodies piled into trenches, one layer after another sprinkled with lime to try to cut down the smell and the spread of contagion. The City of London had to expand its cemeteries almost overnight. Florence dug pits so vast they swallowed thousands at once. A person who survived might spend weeks burying their neighbours, until grief became as routine as eating stale bread. But even here, amid all the earth and sweat, you can hear whispers of something stranger. Locals murmur about ghostly processions, figures walking at dusk, faces hidden beneath cloaks, carrying invisible torches. Some swear that the dead rise from their mass graves to wander back into town, searching for the homes they left behind. It's not just fairy tale chatter. Folklore after the Black Death exploded with these kinds of ghost stories, tales of revenants who carried disease in their wake, of lost children seen at windows long after their bodies were buried. People carved strange protective symbols onto their doors, hoping to keep wandering spirits at bay. Here's the quirky fact. Some priests actually recommended that bells keep ringing not just for the living, but to guide the souls of the dead. Imagine a village with no mass, no choir, but still this lonely, metallic ringing echoing across the countryside, a sound both practical and spectral. Bells were believed to calm the restless dead and reassure the living that some order remained, even when everything else felt unhinged. Of course, scholars debate how much of this ghost lore was a coping mechanism and how much was genuine belief. Were these stories ways of making sense of grief, putting familiar faces back into a world suddenly emptied of them? Or did people really believe the veil between the living and the dead had thinned? That the plague was proof heaven and hell had spilled into the streets? Some historians argue ghost tales were a form of resistance. If the church couldn't explain the plague, maybe the villagers would craft their own narrative. Others see it as the medieval equivalent of horror films, terrifying, but oddly cathartic. For you, standing at the edge of the pit, the atmosphere feels thick enough to believe either story. Survivors work in silence until a low wind rustles through the weeds, and suddenly every shovel pauses. People glance around, eyes darting toward the shadow of the trees. For a moment you think they're about to run, but then someone spits, mutters a prayer, and the digging resumes. You realise that this fear has become a rhythm. Pause, pray, push forward. That's survival in its most stripped-down form. As night falls, the graveyard becomes stranger still. Lanterns bob like fireflies in the dark as the diggers retreat, leaving behind rows of fresh earth that steam in the cool air. You hear a dog bark, then whimper, before silence folds in again. From the town, faint music drifts. Someone is playing a stringed instrument, probably more to keep despair away than to entertain. And in that thin thread of music you can sense how people cling to life, even with graves still open and waiting. The plague has made ghosts of everyone, even the living. People carry themselves differently now, as if stepping lightly so the earth won't notice them. Every glance over the shoulder carries the weight of superstition. And yet, through the digging and the bells and the whispered tales of spirits, something sturdier emerges, a determination not to let the dead rule forever. By the time you leave the graveyards behind, you find yourself standing before manors and castles that once radiated power, but now feel hollow, their banners limp, their gates strangely quiet. The plague did not respect titles, and suddenly the highborn found themselves as vulnerable as the peasants who toiled in their fields. Inside these walls, whole noble lines had been snuffed out. Great halls echo with nothing but the flapping of ravens perched on empty rafters. Inheritance papers sit unsealed on tables because there is no one left to sign them. 1,000 years of carefully guarded bloodlines evaporated in a matter of months. The historical reality is startling. Aristocratic families collapsed so quickly that some regions of Europe faced political chaos. In England, certain noble estates were passed down to distant cousins who had never expected to wear fine cloaks or command retainers. In Italy, the extinction of dynasties opened the door for new merchant families to seize control. The plague didn't just thin the population, it ripped holes in the very fabric of governance. Kings lost councillors, lords lost heirs, and suddenly power was up for grabs like coins spilled in the street. And where there is power to grab, there is ambition. Survivors with even the faintest family tie to a fallen house scrambled to prove their lineage. Forgeries of genealogies flourished. Priests were bribed to remember that some forgotten cousin really did have the right to inherit a vanished estate. Opportunistic marriages were arranged overnight, widows and widowers becoming the most sought-after figures in town. A knight who yesterday had nothing but a rusting sword might, through one quick marriage, inherit lands stretching farther than he could patrol. Here's the quirky twist. There are records of children as young as 2 or 3 suddenly becoming lords, or ladies, of vast estates, because they were the only surviving heirs. Imagine a toddler in swaddling clothes technically owning a castle, while their nursemaid handled everything. These child rulers became symbolic figureheads, while guardians, often very eager ones, ran the show behind the scenes. Some historians joke that Europe briefly entered its kindergarten nobility phase, but scholars debate just how chaotic these successions really were. Some argue that medieval bureaucracy, while messy, had enough resilience to absorb the shock. Others insist that the Black Death marked a genuine rupture, forcing societies into power experiments that would later shape things like centralised monarchy or the rise of the bourgeoisie. Was this chaos an accident, or was it the seed of modern governance? The jury is still out. For you, wandering through the echoing halls of an emptied castle, the debate feels less academic and more personal. You picture the banquets that once filled this room, candles dripping wax onto oak tables, minstrels strumming lutes, gossip flying faster than arrows. Now, the long table is dust-covered, plates still stacked, a half-empty goblet tilting on its side. The silence feels heavier than in the graveyard, because here it carries the weight of lost authority. Outside, peasants eye the castle with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Do they still bow when they pass the gates, or do they glance at one another with a flicker of thought? What if the rules are different now? You can almost see the gears turning. A world without clear masters means room for boldness. For centuries, loyalty had been drilled into them like a prayer, but now, with noble bloodlines cut short, new possibilities whisper in the wind. You keep walking, and you notice something subtle. The survivors aren't just mourning, they're reimagining. Widows are no longer only caretakers of estates, they're negotiators, traders, deal makers. Young men who would have spent their lives as third sons with no inheritance suddenly find themselves courted by powerful households. Even the servants left behind begin to walk taller, as if the absence of lords has given them a little more air to breathe. And yet in these hollowed halls there's also a fear of instability. No one knows whether tomorrow will bring order or civil war. Will new alliances form smoothly, or will daggers flash in the night? For now, the castles stand like husks of a fading world, waiting for someone brave, or reckless, enough to claim them. Past the castles, the silence changes texture. Out here, in the open countryside, the emptiness is measured not by echoing halls, but by the sound of wind brushing through untended fields. Wheat stalks bend in the breeze, tall and golden but going to waste. You step into what should be a farmer's paradise. Fields that once demanded dozens of hands now stand wild. Weeds pushing up through furrows, oxen gone feral in abandoned barns. The plague didn't just rip through towns, it pulled the plug on the entire agricultural engine that kept bread on the table. And if you were one of the hungry survivors, every wasted ear of grain was a reminder that survival was about to get complicated. The historical fact here is stark. Food production plummeted in the years right after the Black Death. Entire villages were depopulated, leaving crops unharvested and livestock roaming without owners. In some places there were reports of dogs feasting on cattle carcasses left to rot in pastures. Fields turned into meadows, hedges crept back in, and orchards grew wild. At first glance it sounds like famine should have been inevitable, but the math was odd. With half the population gone, there were fewer mouths to feed. That paradox meant hunger was real but uneven. Some regions starved, others had more bread than anyone could finish. Here's where it gets quirky. In parts of England, peasants actually dined better than they ever had before. Chroniclers noted that meat, cheese and ale were suddenly more available because there weren't enough nobles or clergy left to hoard them. Imagine being a farmhand who once scraped by on thin gruel suddenly eating mutton 3 times a week. Some survivors wrote that it felt like God's redistribution, as if divine justice had reshuffled the table settings of Europe. Of course, scholars still argue over how much peasants' diets really improved. Was it widespread, or just pockets of prosperity that left the poorest still struggling? Some historians emphasise that while diet quality rose for many, others faced brutal shortages because the supply chain was shattered. Mills unmanned, markets closed, roads unsafe. Others see the supposed golden age of peasants as exaggerated, a nostalgic myth born in hindsight. Even in abundance, people lived with the fear that plague could return and empty the table again. For you, walking along these fields, the contradictions are tangible. You pass one farmhouse with fat geese waddling in the yard, their owner looking smug as he salts pork in a barrel. A mile down the road, you see another house with doors hanging open, hearth cold, the orchard stripped by desperate neighbours. Hunger and plenty coexist awkwardly, like 2 neighbours who don't speak to each other but share the same fence. And then comes the bargaining. With so much land lying idle, lords who survived suddenly realised they had more acres than they had workers, and workers, suddenly scarce, realised the leverage had flipped. A ploughman who once begged for scraps now had the power to walk away and find a lord more desperate. Imagine standing in a muddy field with a hoe in your hand and realising for the first time that you, a dirt-smeared peasant, could name your price. It's not as though this shift erased hardship. People were still poor, still scarred, still terrified, but in the cracks of the old order, opportunity grew like weeds. You notice a group of men haggling with the steward at the edge of a manor field. The steward sweats, glances nervously toward the empty manor house, then finally agrees to wages in coin rather than food. The peasants grin. That single handshake is the faint pulse of something revolutionary, the end of unquestioned feudal obedience. Still, there's unease. Too much food in one place, too little in another. Too much land, too few hands. You feel the tension as people eye both their luck and their losses. The fields are no longer just places of labour. They're mirrors of how society itself is changing. Crooked, unpredictable, and somehow fertile all the same. You follow the sound of hammers and voices into a village square, and it's here that the quiet desperation of the fields transforms into something louder, almost rebellious. A group of men stand in front of a steward, arms crossed, mud-caked on their boots, and you can tell right away that this isn't a begging crowd. This is a bargaining one. Scarcity has flipped the script. Labourers, once the most disposable people in the kingdom, are now the most valuable. If a lord wants his wheat harvested, his mills turning, his rents collected, he suddenly has to pay. The Black Death didn't just kill, it inflated wages like a balloon about to pop. The historical record gives us a clear picture. Wages rose across Europe after the plague. With the population slashed, the demand for workers skyrocketed, and peasants knew it. In England, agricultural wages nearly doubled in some places within a decade. Artisans, masons, and carpenters could now command fees that would have made their fathers choke. Chroniclers complained that common folk were dressing above their station, eating too well, and even, heaven forbid, refusing to work when the terms didn't suit them. Imagine medieval bosses ranting about lazy workers, while peasants finally bought better shoes. Here's the quirky twist. Records show some lords tried bribery with perks instead of money. Extra ale rations, new cloaks, or even promises of land use were thrown in to sweeten deals. One story tells of a landowner offering a worker not just wages but the use of his pond for fishing rights, a perk that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. You could say medieval peasants were early inventors of the benefits package. But here comes the scholarly debate. Just how radical was this shift? Some historians argue that wage gains were real but short-lived, smothered by laws like England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to freeze pay at pre-plague levels. Others insist those laws were like trying to nail water to the wall, unenforceable in the long run because peasants had tasted leverage, and once you've tasted it, you don't go back. The long-term view suggests these early wage battles were the opening notes of a centuries-long symphony leading toward capitalism and labour rights. Still, It wasn't a neat straight line. Many workers were crushed by fines, threats, or worse when they pushed too far. For you, watching this square unfold, the tension is electric. The steward blusters, waving a parchment that declares wages must remain fixed, but no one is impressed. A farmhand cracks a joke about how parchment doesn't plough fields. The crowd chuckles, low and dangerous, and you realise that something bigger than farming is happening here. It's the sound of ordinary people realising their worth. The irony is that lords themselves are often desperate. With heirs dead, estates fractured, and debts piling up, many landowners can't afford to lose what few workers they have. Some reluctantly give in, muttering about divine punishment for their lazy peasants. Others clamp down harder, enforcing curfews, punishing wanderers, and chaining labourers to the land. The tug-of-war becomes brutal, but the peasants have leverage they've never held before, and some of them are willing to risk everything to push further. You pass a group of women hauling baskets of grain, and one of them winks at you as if to say, "We know what's happening here." They've always worked, always carried the weight of survival, but now even their labour has bargaining power. It feels as though the village is vibrating on the edge of change, torn between the old world of obedience and a new one of negotiation. By the time evening falls, the steward has given in. The workers disperse, pockets a little heavier, heads a little higher. You linger in the square, aware that you've just witnessed not only a haggling match but the faint beginnings of a social revolution. The plague might have broken everything, but in that rubble workers are quietly building something new, with coins in their hands and a sharper sense of their own value. The clang of coins and the swagger of peasants with new bargaining power ripple outward. But in the cities, the shift looks different. You wander through a narrow street where wooden signs painted with hammers, scissors, and looms dangle above doorways. This is the domain of the guilds, shoemakers, blacksmiths, weavers, each with their own tight rules, handshakes, and pride. Before the plague, these guilds were like little empires inside the city walls, controlling who could practice a craft, how much could be charged, and who got to rise through the ranks from apprentice to master. But now, with so many masters and journeymen gone, the whole system is wobbling like a stool with one leg sawed too short. Historically, the Black Death hammered guilds almost as much as it did farms. In places like Florence and Paris, half of some guild membership simply vanished. Shops stood shuttered, apprentices were orphaned, elaborate guild feasts dwindled to a handful of survivors sitting around an oversized table. Some guilds tried to cling to tradition, rewriting rules so tightly that entry was restricted to keep standards high. Others flung their doors open, desperate for warm bodies, letting in workers who a decade earlier would have been turned away. Suddenly, someone with a little skill and a lot of luck could leapfrog into positions that once required years of grinding. Here's the quirky detail. Some guilds took their survival rituals to odd extremes. In Nuremberg, the Butchers' Guild reportedly carried out elaborate public processions where they paraded around dressed in blood-smeared aprons, both as a show of strength and as a reminder of their sacrifice. In Venice, glassmakers, already treated like rock stars of the medieval world, tightened their ranks so much after the plague that some surviving families guarded their glass-blowing secrets with a paranoia that bordered on comedy. If you sneezed near a glassmaker, they might suspect espionage. The scholarly debate is sharp here. Did the Black Death weaken guilds permanently, or make them more powerful? Some historians argue that cracks in guild systems after the plague let in new energy, new workers, new techniques, that paved the way for Renaissance innovation. Others believe the guilds doubled down, becoming more conservative, stifling creativity, and trying to freeze society in a kind of amber. Even today, the evidence swings both ways depending on the city you look at. In Florence, guilds helped sponsor stunning new art and architecture. In smaller towns, they ossified, locking out outsiders even harder. For you, strolling through this half-empty guild street, the tension is palpable. A cobbler stares bitterly at the empty stall across from him, once owned by his rival. Now he grumbles that the rival's apprentice has dared to open his own shop, skipping all the rules of guild apprenticeship. Down the street, a group of surviving journeymen huddle, whispering about forming a brotherhood of their own, free from guild masters entirely. You can almost feel the system bending and cracking under the strain of survival. And then there's the human side. Guilds were not just businesses, but social safety nets. members paid into funds to support widows, bury the dead, and feed orphans. With so many members gone, those funds were drained overnight. Some widows petitioned to keep running shops in their husbands' names, and surprisingly, many were allowed. Picture a woman behind the forge, hammering iron with soot on her face, while officials mutter that it's irregular but necessary. The world of work has been cracked open, and the guilds are scrambling to decide whether to glue it back together or let it reshape itself. As the evening bells toll, you notice that the street has a strange hum to it, not bustling, but restless. Craftsmen sharpen their tools as if sharpening arguments, apprentices glance nervously at half-empty guild halls, and widows count coins in their palms. The guilds may survive, but they won't look the same again, and you can't shake the sense that, here in these crooked alleys, the seeds of both conflict and creativity are quietly being hammered into place. Leaving behind the cities and their squabbling guilds, you follow the dusty roads where the real aftermath of the plague plays out in motion. Survivors are wandering. Some trudge alone, faces hidden under hoods. Others move in ragged clusters like caravans without banners. It feels like the entire social order has spilled out of its boxes. Former tenants abandon empty villages to search for richer lands. Craftsmen sling their tools over their shoulders, hoping to find a town desperate enough to pay them double. Even children trail along with makeshift packs, following rumours of food and safety. Europe has become a continent of drifters. Historically, this was one of the great migrations of the Middle Ages. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it loosened the glue that kept people tied to their lords and towns. Laws forbade peasants from leaving, but with whole communities gone, who was left to enforce them? In England, records show entire hamlets deserted, their houses collapsing back into the earth. In Germany, lost villages became a common phrase, and even today archaeologists stumble across ghost settlements erased in the 14th century. It wasn't just people moving, it was landscapes being abandoned and reimagined. The quirky fact here is that wanderers sometimes gained a reputation almost like folk heroes. Ballads spoke of masterless men, travelling workers who refused to settle down, drifting from manor to manor, always demanding better pay. Lords cursed them as troublemakers, but peasants whispered admiration, the way you'd cheer for an outlaw who got away with robbing the sheriff. One English chronicler even complained that these roving bands of workers spent more time drinking and dancing than labouring, a complaint that oddly sounds like envy. But scholars debate how much freedom these wanderers truly had. Some argue they were trailblazers of social change, shaking off feudal chains and proving that mobility could bring opportunity. Others suggest their lives were precarious, chased by sheriffs, fined, beaten, and forced back into servitude whenever possible. Was wandering empowerment or desperation dressed up as freedom? The truth probably lay somewhere in between, liberation for some, misery for many. You watch a small group pass by, 2 young men with scythes strapped across their backs, a woman carrying a child, and an old man with a lute slung over his shoulder. They pause at a crossroads, glance at the weathered signpost and argue about which way to go. The men want to follow rumours of high wages in Flanders. The woman swears she's heard of abandoned farms in Burgundy just waiting to be claimed. The old man strums a few notes, as if mocking the seriousness of the debate, then they shuffle on together, laughter mixing uneasily with the crunch of boots. The road itself tells a story. Inns are crowded with wanderers trading gossip about which lords pay fairly, and which ones send guards to chase workers away. Bridges are dotted with makeshift shrines where travellers light candles for those who didn't make it past the plague or past hunger. In the ditches you see bones, not always human, but enough to remind you that wandering is dangerous, and yet, for many, staying put feels even more dangerous. By nightfall the roads transform into meeting grounds of suspicion and opportunity. A merchant caravan rattles by, guarded heavily against both thieves and desperate beggars. 2 men in patched tunics stop you to ask if you've heard of work in the next town. Their eyes are sharp, wary, but also burning with a hope that feels new, raw, and a little terrifying. Mobility itself has become currency. The ability to walk away from your lord's land and find another life is the kind of power peasants never had before. As you drift into sleep under a hedge with other wanderers, you hear the chorus of restless Europe, footsteps crunching, wheels creaking, voices bargaining in dozens of tongues. This is a continent in motion, unsure of its destination but certain that it cannot stay still. By the time you return to the towns, the streets hum with a different kind of noise. Sermons echoing from pulpits, bells tolling at odd hours, and the low murmur of confession lines stretching like bread queues. The church is everywhere, yet it feels weaker than ever. You slip into a cathedral expecting the comfort of ritual, but instead you find priests whose voices waver like candle flames in a draught. The Black Death has shaken their authority down to its bones. People come not for answers, they already know the answers have failed, but for scraps of reassurance, for some sign that God hasn't turned his face away forever. Historically, the church faced one of its greatest crises in the wake of the plague. Priests had fled towns at the height of infection, monasteries were gutted by deaths, and whole parishes went without sacraments for months. Survivors remembered this abandonment. Trust fractured. Chroniclers complain that poorly trained replacements, sometimes barely literate, were rushed into service just to fill gaps. The clergy's power was still immense, but its credibility was punctured, and you can feel the unease buzzing like flies in a chapel. The quirky detail here is how desperate some church rituals became. In certain towns, priests organised elaborate processions, parading relics through the streets, shards of saints' bones, splinters of the true cross, even holy feathers said to be from angel wings. The logic was simple. If the plague ignored prayers, maybe it would respect objects. These processions were half religious devotion, half medieval theatre, with townsfolk weeping as the relics swayed past, hoping a scrap of bone could hold back death. But scholars argue about how deeply this shook the church's long-term grip. Was the Black Death a true turning point in weakening ecclesiastical authority, or just a bruise that healed over time? Some argue it opened the door to later reform movements, Wycliffe, Huss, Luther, by planting seeds of disillusionment. Others caution that despite the cracks, the church remained the central force in European life for centuries afterward. The debate rests on whether you see these cracks as small hairlines or as fault lines waiting for the next quake. For you, sitting on a stone pew, the debate feels less abstract. You watch a priest give a sermon about sin being the cause of the plague, his voice rising with fire. But as he speaks, an old woman mutters under her breath about rats and spoiled air. Two young men in the back roll their eyes, whispering about how prayers didn't save their families. Faith is still here, but it's brittle, challenged openly in whispers and occasionally in shouts. And yet, people crave the rituals. Baptisms, funerals, marriages, they've all multiplied. Survivors rush to have children baptized, terrified of leaving them spiritually unprotected. Weddings spike because widows and widowers scramble to stabilize their households. Funerals, of course, are endless. The church may be weakened, but it remains the one institution capable of wrapping life's chaos in the thin comfort of ceremony. As you step outside into the courtyard, the contradictions collide. Pilgrims light candles at a shrine, faces wet with tears. Just a few paces away, a group of young men scoff about whether saints' bones are just old sticks. The air smells of incense and doubt. The church is both indispensable and vulnerable, a pillar cracked but still standing. And in that uneasy balance, you can sense the beginning of a new world, where even God's representatives must answer to the disillusionment of the people they once ruled unquestioned. The church bells may keep ringing, but if you lean in closer, you catch a different sound. Whispers slipping through taverns, murmurs traded in fields, rumours muttered by candlelight. These aren't the voices of obedience, they're the voices of dissent. After the Black Death, with so many priests gone and faith cracked wide open, radical ideas crept into the cracks like weeds through cobblestones. You walk past a group of peasants clustered under a tree, and one man speaks with a fierce gleam in his eyes. Maybe God isn't punishing them. Maybe the priests lied. Maybe the church itself has failed. And just like that, heresy moves from an abstract threat to something you can almost touch in the air. Historically, the plague fueled suspicion toward the clergy and gave rise to small but growing heretical movements. John Wycliffe in England, a few decades later, would rail against the church's wealth and argue that scripture, not priests, was the true source of authority. In Bohemia, Jan Hus would fan similar flames. Even before them, groups like the Lollards and the remnants of Cathar or Waldensian sects found new ears willing to listen. The trauma of mass death made people braver, or more reckless, about questioning sacred institutions. Here's the quirky fact. One chronicler claimed that peasants in the Low Countries gathered around makeshift preachers who carried no crosses, but instead held up bread or even simple stones. declaring these to be just as holy as any relic. Imagine standing in a muddy field while a barefoot man holds up a rock and says, "This is as close to God as the bishop's jewelled chalice." To the desperate, it felt revolutionary. To the authorities, it was pure blasphemy. The scholarly debate here is sharp. Was the plague itself the spark of heresy, or would these movements have flourished anyway? Some historians see the Black Death as gasoline poured on a smouldering fire, people disillusioned, searching for explanations, finally bold enough to break with tradition. Others argue heresy was already brewing from economic inequality and political corruption, and the plague just accelerated a timeline already in motion. Either way, the whispers were spreading, and the church noticed. You catch a glimpse of how risky this could be. The man preaching under the tree lowers his voice when he sees a friar pass on the road. The peasants nod but glance around nervously, their bodies caught between hunger for new ideas and fear of a burning stake. Later, you overhear two women in a market muttering about how indulgences are nothing but purchased lies. They laugh, quickly cover their mouths, and then exchange apples as if sealing a dangerous secret. What you sense most strongly is that faith hasn't disappeared. It's shifting. People still want meaning, still crave explanations for why death swept their families away. But instead of turning only upward, they're starting to turn sideways, to one another, to community preachers, to underground gatherings. Some cling harder than ever to orthodoxy, terrified of punishment. Others lean into rebellion, convinced that God must be found outside the gilded cathedrals. By nightfall, the tavern fills with muttering again. A drunk labourer pounds his fist on the table, insisting that priests grow fat while peasants starve. Across the room, a merchant quietly counters, warning that talk like this could get them all in chains. You sip watered wine and realise you're sitting in the tension of a Europe that's no longer spiritually uniform. The whispers of heresy may not yet roar, but they're swelling, and you know they'll echo louder with each generation that follows. By the time dawn streaks across the rooftops, you hear a different kind of murmur rising, one not from taverns or pulpits, but from classrooms. You duck into a drafty hall, where a handful of students hunch over wooden desks, quills scratching as a weary master paces at the front. The plague tore through universities just as it did guilds and monasteries, wiping out professors and scattering students. And yet, here you are, watching as survivors piece learning back together, one ink blot at a time. Education, like farming or worship, had to be rebuilt from near collapse. Historically, the Black Death devastated centres of learning. Oxford, Paris, Bologna, enrolment plummeted. Some colleges shut their doors entirely for years. Professors died mid-lecture. Libraries sat untouched as dust collected on vellum pages. But in that emptiness, opportunity appeared. With fewer scholars, ambitious students advanced faster. Universities began experimenting with shorter programs, pushing students into the world quicker to fill gaps in administration, law and medicine. A degree that once demanded a decade could suddenly be had in half the time. Here's the quirky twist. With teachers gone, some students just started teaching themselves and each other. In Bologna, chroniclers describe young scholars pooling their notes, creating makeshift study circles where they debated without formal masters. Imagine a bunch of medieval students crammed into a tavern, parchment spread across the table, arguing about Aristotle between mugs of ale. It was chaotic, sure, but it also broke down the rigid hierarchy of learning. Knowledge wasn't just handed down from on high, it was passed sideways, like bread shared at a feast. The scholarly debate here lingers over whether the plague truly changed the nature of education or merely jolted it temporarily. Some argue the crisis nudged Europe toward more practical, career-driven training, proto-modern universities that churned out bureaucrats and physicians. Others insist the core remained the same: Latin lectures, memorization, scholastic debates about theology that could go on for days. What's clear is that the scarcity of teachers forced cracks in the system, and through those cracks new light seeped in. You look around the hall and see evidence of that shift. One student copies a text not on theology, but on astronomy, convinced that the heavens, not the priests, might explain disease. Another is sketching bones in the margins of his notebook, probably sneaking glances from dissections carried out in secret. The master, clearly exhausted, drones about Aristotle's humours, but half the students are already thinking beyond humours, beyond Aristotle. In the gaps left by death, curiosity starts stretching its arms. Libraries, too, become strange places. With so many owners gone, collections of books are suddenly available for sale or simply abandoned. Survivors scoop them up. Wealthy merchants who'd never cared for scrolls before now purchase whole collections, sometimes more for prestige than scholarship. But the effect is the same. Books spread. You picture dusty tomes travelling from monastery to merchant house, passing into hands that might actually read them with fresh eyes. And then there's the very human detail. A boy in the back of the hall sneezes and everyone stiffens. The memory of plague is so raw that even a sniffle draws side eyes. The master sighs, crosses himself and continues. But the tension never fully leaves. It's as if every lesson, every word inked onto parchment, carries the weight of survival. Knowledge itself feels fragile, balanced on the edge of erasure. By evening, when the students pack up their scrolls and stumble into the street, the air smells of ink and damp wool. They look more like wanderers than scholars, but there's a spark in their eyes. They aren't just keeping knowledge alive, they're reshaping it, pushing it into new corners, letting ideas breed in places no one expected. The plague tried to silence Europe's classrooms, but in the scratch of those quills, you hear the stubborn refusal of learning to die. The scratching of quills fades behind you, and soon you find yourself in a much stranger place. A cluttered chamber, where books and bones share the same shelves. It smells of wax, ink, and something faintly sour, like old earth. This is not a tidy university library. It's the domain of survivors who became unlikely heroes of the rebuilding era. Scribes, collectors, and even the lowly gravediggers. Everyone, in their own way, became a custodian of memory. The plague didn't just erase lives, it threatened to erase knowledge and tradition. So people clung to whatever scraps they could salvage, whether on parchment or in bone. Historically, the years after the Black Death saw a rush to preserve and copy texts. Monks who survived redoubled their efforts to copy manuscripts, often working with an intensity that left pages smudged and margins full of hasty doodles. Collectors hoarded anything that smelled of wisdom, medical treatises, herbals, astrological charts, even old pagan writings dug up from forgotten chests. A single book could now command the value of a small farm. And in the same breath, bones became repositories of memory too. Relics of saints, fragments of ancestors, even skulls carefully arranged in charnel houses as physical proof that life went on. Here's the quirky fact. Some gravediggers, who had spent the plague waist-deep in corpses, turned into unofficial historians. They claimed to know which families had lost the most, which streets had collapsed, which graves belonged to the wealthy versus the poor. In Prague, one such gravedigger allegedly kept a running tally scratched into a plank of wood, boasting of his record of bodies buried. Morbid, yes, but he became a kind of local authority. People asked him for stories the way others would consult chronicles. In a twisted sense, he was an archivist of mortality. Scholars still debate how much the plague accelerated the rediscovery of older texts, particularly Greek and Roman works. Was the sudden hunger for knowledge a reaction to catastrophe? The survivors tried to grasp any thread of explanation? Or was it simply part of a larger trend that would have unfolded anyway, feeding into the Renaissance whether or not the plague happened? Some argue the trauma of mass death sparked an almost desperate urgency to remember, to not let human wisdom slip into the pit along with the bodies. Others caution that this urgency may be exaggerated by hindsight, our need to find meaning in the chaos. You leaf through one of the manuscripts in this cluttered room. The parchment is thick, uneven, the ink slightly blurred. In the margin, a doodle of a little dancing skeleton waves at you. Proof that even in their grim task, scribes found room for gallows humour. On a shelf nearby sits a stack of bones, bleached and clean, arranged with unsettling neatness. To the scribe, they are reminders. Every page copied is defiance against forgetting. Every bone stacked is proof that lives once filled these streets. Outside you see another kind of preservation. Merchants, flush with inheritance from dead relatives, are buying manuscripts to decorate their homes. They may not read a word of Latin, but they understand that books are symbols of survival, prestige, and perhaps even protection. Knowledge becomes both sacred and fashionable, and its keepers, whether scribes, monks, or collectors, become unlikely celebrities. And yet, not all is noble. Some manuscripts are deliberately edited as they're recopied, with scribes inserting their own explanations for the plague. Divine wrath, planetary misalignment, corrupted air. In preserving knowledge, they also reshape it. You realise that memory itself is unstable, bending under the weight of trauma. The truth of the Black Death will be told and retold, each copy a little different, each bone rearranged with a slightly new meaning. By nightfall, the room is lit only by the soft glow of candles. The scribe bends over his parchment, lips moving silently as he traces each word. His hand trembles, not from fear but from exhaustion, yet he doesn't stop. Somewhere in the courtyard beyond, the gravedigger drags another sack of bones toward the ossuary, humming a low tune. Books and bones, two forms of memory, fragile, incomplete, but stubbornly refusing to vanish. When you leave the scribes and their bone-stacked archives, the streets outside feel oddly different. Fuller, busier, but with new faces at the centre of things. A woman in a dark veil argues with a merchant over the price of wool. Another, sleeves rolled high, barks orders at apprentices as if she's been running that workshop for decades. And at the manor edge of town, a widow with a hawk perched on her wrist inspects her fields like a seasoned landowner. This is not the medieval world you read about in children's textbooks where women are cloistered in kitchens and sewing rooms. The Black Death, for all its devastation, left an unexpected gap, and women stepped directly into it. Historically, the plague carved out space for women in ways few other events had. With men gone in staggering numbers, widows inherited estates, shops, and guild memberships. In some cases, city councils even rewrote statutes to allow women to manage businesses that had previously been locked behind the guild wall. In Florence, widows operated textile workshops. In London, records show women taking over taverns, breweries, and even smithies. Entire industries, if only for a time, leaned on women not as silent partners, but as visible leaders. Here's the quirky fact. A chronicler in Paris grumbled that women had become loud in the market and bold in the taverns, which he clearly meant as an insult. But reading between the lines, you hear the truth. Women were running things, and some men didn't like it. There's even evidence of women using new wealth to commission art or donate to churches, securing not just survival, but public legacy. Imagine a medieval widow strolling into a guild hall and dropping coins on the table like a seasoned banker, her rivals forced to nod in reluctant respect. But here's the scholarly debate. Did this newfound agency last? Some argue the post-plague era permanently shifted women's roles, opening cracks that later movements would widen. Others caution that once populations rebounded, patriarchal norms reasserted themselves, pushing women back to the margins. Was this a permanent restructuring or just a temporary detour? Historians still wrangle over it, and the answer may depend on the region. Northern Europe seemed more open to sustaining female-led households. Southern Europe often folded women back into restrictive systems once men returned. For you, wandering these streets, the effect feels immediate and real. You see girls in apprenticeships usually reserved for boys, their hands stained with dye or soot. A woman in fine linen argues in court over a property dispute, her voice steady while a scribe scribbles furiously to keep up. Even in households, the authority has shifted. Matriarchs decide where to plant, what to sell, who to marry. And while not all women thrived, many were still crushed by poverty or remarried quickly under pressure. The sheer visibility of their presence marks a rupture. The changes even ripple into family life. Children suddenly raised by widowed mothers grow up with different models of authority, seeing women command without hesitation. Girls, watching their mothers run shops or fields, learn skills they never would have touched in the old order. And yes, you can sense resistance. Men muttering in taverns, priests reminding congregations about the proper order of things. But you also sense that something has shifted in memory. Even if patriarchy claws back its control, the image of women commanding, trading and inheriting won't be forgotten. As evening settles, you pause near a textile workshop where women and girls sing as they weave. Their laughter rings out into the street, light but purposeful, like a thread stitching new patterns across the old cloth of society. In that sound, you hear both resilience and change, proof that the survivors of the plague weren't just rebuilding what was lost. They were, in some ways, reimagining who got to hold the tools of power. By now you've walked through graveyards, manor halls, guild streets and markets, but nothing prepares you for the reappearance of a figure so strange he looks like he stumbled out of a nightmare. The Plague Doctor. You first spot him at a crossroads, a tall silhouette in a wide-brimmed hat and a mask shaped like a bird's beak. He carries a staff to prod at patients without touching them, and the faint rustle of herbs stuffed into his mask trails him like incense. To the villagers, he's half healer, half omen, someone you both pray to see and dread when he arrives at your door. Historically, the so-called plague doctors became emblematic of the crisis, though their actual usefulness is still debated. They wore long waxed coats, gloves, and those iconic masks filled with aromatics, rosemary, lavender, cloves, believing that bad air or miasma carried the disease. Their staffs kept patients at a distance, while their records provided some of the earliest systematic accounts of outbreaks. In Venice, for example, municipal governments actually hired plague doctors on salary, giving them official roles as both healers and data collectors. Here's the quirky fact. Some of these doctors weren't doctors at all. Records show that the job was sometimes handed to second-rate physicians, barbers, or even desperate men willing to risk infection for pay. Imagine a barber who spent most of his life trimming beards suddenly donning a beaked mask and declaring himself an expert on pestilence. In a sense, plague doctors were part healer, part bureaucrat, part performance art. Scholars still argue about their effectiveness. Some historians view plague doctors as more symbolic than practical, a comfort to communities that wanted to believe someone was doing something. Others point to their notes, some surprisingly detailed, which tracked symptoms, mortality rates, and even potential contagion patterns. These observations, however crude, nudged medicine toward empirical study, laying groundwork for public health measures centuries later. Were they quacks in costumes, or the awkward birth of epidemiology? The debate hasn't ended. For you, watching this particular plague doctor approach, the tension is unmistakable. A family ushers him inside their cottage, crossing themselves. You linger at the window and hear the scrape of his staff against the floorboards as he circles the sickbed. His mask dips close to the patient, the herbs inside muffling the stench. He scribbles something onto parchment, mutters a prayer, and taps the ground twice with his staff before leaving. The family thanks him as though he's a saint, even though he's given no medicine, just presence and procedure. Children, of course, can't resist mocking him. You pass a gaggle of them later, giggling and waddling around with sticks for staffs and paper cones strapped to their faces. To them, he's a kind of grim clown. Adults hush them quickly, eyes darting, afraid of tempting fate. But the fact remains, the plague doctor is now part of the collective imagination, both feared and parodied. By nightfall, you find the doctor again, standing by a fire where he burns soiled linens and sprinkles vinegar into the flames. He looks more like a ritualist than a healer, but there's something oddly reassuring in his repetition. The world has been reduced to uncertainty, and even a man in a bird mask offers a fragile sense of control. Whether or not he heals, he reminds people that survival still has its rituals. The bird-masked doctor fades into the smoky horizon, and as you walk deeper into the town another sound rises, the sharp crack of hammers striking stone, the grind of carts hauling timber, the shouts of masons calling for mortar. You've arrived at the city walls, where survivors now labour not against disease, but against memory and fear. The plague may have thinned the population, but Europe still lived in a world of raids, bandits, and rival neighbours, and in the wake of the Black Death, towns took rebuilding as an opportunity to refortify, as if bricks and battlements might shield them from the invisible as well as the visible. Historically, many cities poured resources into repairing and expanding their fortifications after the plague. Abandoned stretches of wall were patched, watchtowers refitted, and gates reinforced. Some rulers even launched ambitious building programs, framing them as both protection and renewal. In London, portions of the old Roman wall were shored up. In Italian city-states like Siena and Florence, massive projects were proposed, some completed, others left as half-finished skeletons when money or labour ran short. The walls weren't just military defences, they were psychological ones. To stand behind stone was to feel less exposed to chaos. Here's the quirky detail. Some communities believed walls could block not only armies but also pestilence itself. Chronicles mention towns digging trenches and sealing gates in hopes of keeping out bad air. One German town even placed guards at its walls not to fight soldiers, but to sniff strangers and decide whether they smelled ill. It sounds absurd now, but to medieval minds, a sealed gate could be a shield against both sword and sickness. The scholarly debate turns on whether these construction projects were acts of resilience or desperation. Some historians argue they reflected real political strength, cities flexing their recovery, proving to rivals that they were still standing tall. Others see them as hollow gestures, empty shells that couldn't protect against plague or poverty, and that sometimes drained treasuries needed for food or rebuilding homes. Did these walls symbolise survival, or were they monuments to fear? The answer may be both. For you, standing on scaffolding alongside the masons, the walls feel like a mixture of triumph and futility. A young builder smears mortar with a grin, proud that he's earning higher wages than his father ever dreamed. Another mutters about the pointlessness of piling stone when death walks through keyholes. Below, children play among heaps of rubble, pretending to be knights defending the city, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the weary rhythm of hammers. You notice that fortifications also serve a quieter purpose: jobs. With fields lying wild and guilds unstable, construction offers steady work. Men who once bent over ploughs now haul stone. Widows provide food and drink to crews, turning labour into an economy of survival. Rebuilding walls isn't just about defence, it's a social glue, a way to bind the fragments of the community back together through sweat and dust. As the day wanes, you climb a finished tower. From up here, the countryside stretches endlessly, dotted with abandoned villages and silent fields. Yet behind the wall, you see life resuming. Markets opening, children chasing geese, women hauling buckets from the well. The wall doesn't erase fear, but it frames it, giving people a boundary to live within. And as the sun dips, you understand why survivors keep stacking stone. Not because it will stop death, but because it feels like doing something, and sometimes doing something is enough to keep despair at bay. From the top of the city wall, your gaze follows the horizon toward the distant roads and rivers. They look quiet now, but you can almost hear the groan of carts and the creak of ship masts ready to stir again. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval towns, was strangled during the plague. Routes blocked, ports shuttered, caravans abandoned in the wilderness. Yet even in the shadow of mass graves, merchants were some of the first to test the roads again. Greed, survival, and curiosity all pulled in the same direction, back toward the markets. Historically, commerce resumed surprisingly quickly. Venetian and Genoese fleets once feared as carriers of death began sailing again, their harbours thrumming with cautious energy. The Hanseatic League, that sprawling network of North Sea and Baltic traders, struggled with population loss but soon reasserted itself, moving grain, cloth and salt between cities desperate to restock. Markets reopened, though often haltingly, one week buzzing, the next week closed after rumours of plague in a neighbouring town. Here's the quirky fact. Many traders started carrying health passports, documents stamped by local officials declaring their home city free of plague. These were medieval equivalents of vaccination cards, though usually worthless. A merchant might wave a stamped piece of parchment at a guard while his cargo of grain squirmed with plague-carrying rats. Still, people clung to them, because the illusion of safety was sometimes the only way to keep business flowing. The scholarly debate here is whether trade was more of a blessing or a curse in this period. Some argue it was essential for recovery, bringing food, tools and luxury goods to communities hollowed out by loss. Others point out it also reintroduced fear, spreading not just rumours but occasional flare-ups of disease. Was reopening the roads an act of courage or recklessness? Historians still weigh whether Europe's resilience outweighed the risks of renewed contagion. For you, stepping into a reopened market square, the atmosphere is both festive and tense. Merchants call out from their stalls, silks from Lucca, saltfish from the Baltic, pepper from Alexandria. Yet the crowd keeps a nervous distance, eyeing foreign traders with suspicion. One woman spits on the ground after a sailor walks by, muttering about stranger's breath. The smells of roasted meat and exotic spices mingle with the stench of vinegar-soaked rags tied to stall posts, a crude attempt to purify the air. On the riverbank, a ship creaks as its crew unloads barrels. Dock workers gossip about whether it came from a plague-struck port. One insists the sailors look too healthy. Another swears he saw a rat leap from the rope onto the quay. The ship's captain waves his health passport with theatrical flair, laughing off the mutters, but you can feel the unease rippling through the crowd. Profit has returned, but so has paranoia. Yet the pull of trade is irresistible. Towns starved of resources welcome it. Survivors eager to spend their small windfalls crave it. Widows use inheritance money to buy bright cloth. Peasants with new wages taste foreign spices for the first time. The plague left empty bellies and coffers, and trade promises to fill them again. Even fear bends before the lure of cinnamon and silk. By nightfall the market quiets, stalls shuttered, and torches flicker along the docks. A merchant sits on a barrel, counting coins with a grin, while just a few steps away a friar warns a small crowd that foreign goods carry not blessings but curses. You realise trade has returned not as a simple lifeline, but as a gamble. Every shipment a bet between prosperity and peril. And still, the wagons roll, the ships sail, because Europe has always been willing to risk its life for the chance to live better. The market stalls fade into shadows, but something else catches your eye. A sudden flash of colour. Against the grey stone and brown wool of everyday survival, a young man struts past in a tunic dyed a shocking crimson, its hem scandalously short above his knees. A woman follows in a gown lined with fur, her veil sheer enough to turn heads. The Black Death had ripped open society's fabric, and now survivors are stitching it back together with brighter, bolder threads. Fashion has become both a rebellion and a proclamation. I lived. Historically, clothing did shift after the plague, and not just because so many wardrobes were suddenly up for grabs. With labourers demanding higher wages and fewer mouths left to inherit wealth, survivors often had more money to spend on luxuries. Tailors experimented with shorter tunics for men, tighter bodices for women, and an explosion of colour that shocked the conservative old guard. The sumptuary laws, those endless medieval rules about who could wear what, were suddenly impossible to enforce. When half the nobility is gone, who's left to stop a peasant from strutting around in velvet? Here's the quirky detail. Some chroniclers fumed that survivors dressed with indecent gaiety, as though the plague had unleashed not piety but vanity. In Florence, men were accused of slashing their sleeves to show off expensive linings, a trend so ridiculous it caught on across Europe. In England, shoes became absurdly long and pointy, so long that nobles tied the tips to their knees with chains. Imagine surviving the deadliest pandemic in history, then immediately deciding, yes, what I need now are clown shoes that double as trip hazards. Scholars debate what this sartorial explosion really meant. Was it simple indulgence, the human urge to enjoy life after staring into the grave? Or was it a deeper social statement, a way for peasants and merchants to blur class lines by adopting styles once reserved for elites? Some argue the plague democratized fashion. Survivors flaunted what they could afford, not what they were allowed. Others counter that elites quickly reasserted control, inventing new, stricter sumptuary laws to shove people back into visible hierarchies. Either way, clothing became a battlefield of identity in the years after the plague. You walk through a street where tailors' shops are bustling. Bolts of bright cloth spill out of doorways, greens, blues, yellows so vivid they make the drab earth tones of pre-plague life look funereal. A widow with silver coins jingling in her purse commissions a gown trimmed with sable, daring the council to stop her. Apprentices laugh as they stitch flamboyant hats with feathers that bob like roosters' combs. The air smells of dye vats and ambition. Not everyone approves. You overhear a friar scolding a group of youths for wasting money on vanity instead of alms. The boys roll their eyes, tugging their short tunics higher just to spite him. Across the square, an elderly woman shakes her head, muttering that such fashions invite another round of divine punishment. But for the younger survivors, fashion isn't sin. It's survival in another form, proof that death didn't take their appetite for joy. By evening, as torches flare, you watch a group of revellers strut through the streets in clothes so bright they almost glow in the firelight. Their laughter is loud, perhaps too loud, as though they're trying to drown out the silence that still haunts the alleys. You realise these garments are more than fabric. Their armour made of colour, stitched with defiance, worn as a promise that life, however precarious, still demands to be celebrated in full view. The revellers in their bright tunics fade into the night, but as dawn creeps over the rooftops, another transformation comes into focus. On a wall near the marketplace, a mural appears. Skeletal figures dancing hand in hand with peasants, nobles, even kings. The paint is fresh, the outlines rough but powerful. You stop and stare. This isn't decoration, it's testimony. Art has shifted, no longer content with saints glowing in gilded frames. After the Black Death, creativity itself seems to crack open, haunted by memory yet reaching for something new. Historically, art after the plague bore deep scars. Churches commissioned frescoes of the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, where skeletons mocked the living by tugging them into the grave. Painters filled canvases with grotesque images of rotting flesh, while sculptors carved cadavers lying side by side with saints. Yet alongside this morbid obsession came renewal. Survivors began to invest in art as a form of commemoration, commissioning altarpieces, chapels, and portraits to honour families who barely survived. Some historians see this as the pivot that carried Europe from medieval rigidity toward Renaissance expression. Here's the quirky fact. In Lübeck, Germany, an entire mural of the Dance of Death stretched across a cloister wall, so vivid that locals joked skeletons would slip off the plaster at night to join the living. The work became a kind of civic attraction, both horrifying and irresistible. Parents even brought children to Gork as if to say, "See? Even emperors end up bones. Eat your bread and be grateful." But scholars wrestle with the meaning of this artistic shift. Was it purely a reflection of trauma, grim reminders that death spares no one? Or was it an early step toward a more human-centered art, where ordinary lives mattered enough to be painted alongside saints? Some argue the Black Death was the shock therapy that loosened art from strict theological chains, encouraging experimentation in realism and emotion. Others caution that the Renaissance was already gestating, and plague art was just a morbid detour before the real flowering. For you, wandering through the town, the effect is overwhelming. You pass a chapel where stained glass glows with new intensity. Colours deeper, faces more expressive. In a workshop, an artist mixes pigments, muttering about how to capture both decay and beauty on a single panel. He shows you a half-finished Madonna whose eyes are red-rimmed with sorrow, unlike the serene, untouchable figures of old. In another corner, a sculptor chisels a tomb effigy of a nobleman, but instead of a serene sleeper, he carves him as a decayed corpse, worms nibbling at the stone ribs. It's grotesque, yet somehow honest. And yet, there's joy too. Children chalk skeletons on walls not in fear but in play, turning the imagery of death into a kind of carnival. Survivors with new wealth order portraits of themselves not as saints in waiting but as flesh and blood humans, dressed in vivid gowns and bright hats. Art is no longer only for the eternal, it's also for the here and now. By evening you stand before another mural, this one newer and stranger. Not skeletons, but farmers harvesting golden fields under a clear blue sky, a vision of abundance. It feels almost like a prayer, painted not with words but with colour. The plague's shadow lingers in every line, yet so does the determination to make beauty rise from ruin. And as the torches flicker against the wall, you realise that in brushstrokes and chisels, survivors are sketching not just their grief but their stubborn hope. The murals linger in your mind, but as you drift down another crooked lane, a different sound takes hold. Music. Not the polished chants of monasteries, but raw human voices rising from doorways and taverns, carried on the night air. You pause at the edge of a courtyard where a group of survivors gather, their songs low and mournful at first, then swelling into something almost defiant. In the wake of the Black Death, music has become both a memorial and a lifeline, half lament, half survival strategy. Historically, plague-era Europe saw music bend and reshape itself. Church choirs thinned to whispers as choristers died or fled, but communities stitched new songs together out of grief. Dirges multiplied, weaving sorrow into melody. Ballads spread by word of mouth, recounting villages lost, lovers separated, and the cruel randomness of death. Folk traditions, long overshadowed by clerical dominance, found new space to flourish. Survivors who couldn't read scripture could still sing, and through singing they preserved stories of both loss and endurance. Here's the quirky fact. Some towns employed plague pipers, whose job was literally to play music during burials, hoping that tunes would soothe both mourners and restless spirits. Chroniclers complained that the pipers sometimes turned rowdy, leading to funerals that felt more like drunken festivals. Imagine standing by a mass grave while someone belts out a tune on bagpipes that sounds suspiciously upbeat. It blurred the line between mourning and mockery, but maybe that was the point. Laughter and grief had become inseparable. The scholarly debate centres on whether the Black Death really altered Europe's musical trajectory or simply amplified existing trends. Some argue that the trauma shifted music toward more emotional, expressive forms, setting the stage for later Renaissance compositions. Others insist the impact was overstated, that most innovations came from courtly or liturgical traditions already underway. What's clear, however, is that folk music, those songs of fields, hearths and taverns, gained a new urgency. When half your world disappears, the need to sing your story becomes impossible to suppress. You watch a circle of villagers singing a call and response ballad, their voices rough but harmonised. The lyrics tell of a harvest abandoned, of lovers promising to meet again when the bells stop tolling. Children hum along, not fully grasping the sorrow embedded in the tune, but carrying it anyway. Music here isn't just art, it's inheritance, a way of making sure grief doesn't dissolve into silence. At the same time, new rhythms creep in. With trade routes reopening, instruments and styles travel farther than before. You overhear a merchant boasting that he brought back an oud from the Levant. It sounds strange but mesmerising. Another fiddler experiments with faster tempos, his bow dancing as if to chase away despair. The contrast is jarring. On one corner, a widow keens a dirge. On the next, youth stomp their feet to a lively jig that dares the darkness to keep up. By nightfall, the town square transforms into a gathering place. Torches burn, mugs clink, and music swells louder. No longer just mourning, but celebration. You realise that this too is a survival tactic. If people can sing together, whether in grief or joy, they are less likely to feel alone. The plague tried to silence Europe, but in every wailing dirge and drunken ballad, the survivors answer back, "We are still here, and we still have voices." The echoes of song still hum in your ears when, weeks later, you find yourself swept into something louder, brighter, and almost dizzying. A festival. The same streets that once smelled of ash and despair now ring with laughter, clatter, and the clanging of bells tied to dancers' ankles. Survivors, tired of mourning, have decided to throw their grief into the air like confetti. Everywhere you look, people wear garlands of flowers, masks painted with grins, and clothes in colours so bright they almost hurt your eyes. This is not denial, it's rebellion. The Black Death tried to drown joy, and Europe answers with carnivals that burn twice as hot as before. Historically, festivals and public rituals surged in the wake of the plague. Towns hosted carnivals, pageants, and feast days with renewed intensity. Religious calendars were thick with saints' days, but post-plague survivors twisted them into hybrid events, half worship, half unrestrained revelry. In Florence, the Feast of San Giovanni turned into an explosion of parades, music, and fireworks. In England, May Day celebrations spread with new vigour, villagers dancing around poles as if daring the earth itself to remember fertility. Even processions of penitents blurred into carnivals, self-flagellants marching while crowds of children mocked them, turning solemnity into theatre. Here's the quirky fact. In some towns, people actually staged mock funerals for the plague itself. Coffins were paraded through streets, filled not with bodies but with straw effigies labelled death, then ceremoniously burned. Imagine watching a community boo and jeer as a scarecrow in a shroud is set alight. The crowd cheering as if they'd just defeated the Grim Reaper in a wrestling match. The scholarly debate circles around whether these festivals were acts of healing or of distraction. Some historians argue they were psychological necessities, structured ways of processing grief through laughter, dancing, and excess. Others see them as pressure valves, sanctioned chaos that prevented uprisings by giving the poor a taste of freedom. Were these carnivals genuine joy, or cleverly tolerated eruptions to keep people docile? The answer, as always, probably lies somewhere between. A little healing, a little control, a lot of noise. You wander through one such carnival now. A troupe of masked performers tumbles across the cobblestones, juggling apples until one bursts in a sticky spray. Children shriek with laughter. A man dressed as a skeleton chases a group of maidens, who squeal before turning and chasing him back. Musicians pound drums and blow horns, their rhythm relentless. Even the clergy get in on the act, sponsoring processions with relics before quietly slipping off to watch jugglers with the rest of the crowd. There's an undercurrent, though. Some survivors dance as if trying to outrun memories. You see a woman whirl until she collapses, breathless and weeping, her friends pulling her back to her feet with shouts of encouragement. Others drink until their laughter tips into manic howls. The festival feels both jubilant and haunted, joy edged with desperation. But maybe that's the point. Laughter isn't the absence of grief, it's survival in its shadow. As night falls, bonfires roar in the square. People throw herbs into the flames, the smoke carrying prayers, or maybe just superstition, into the sky. Couples slip into the shadows, children chase sparks, and old men toast to the fact they're still alive. You sit at the edge of the firelight watching faces glow orange and realise this. The festivals aren't just about forgetting the plague, they're about daring to remember, and then dancing anyway. The fires of the carnival smoulder down to ash, and when the dawn smoke clears, you find yourself in a quieter chamber, one that smells of herbs, ink, and something sour. This is no marketplace or festival ground, but the workshop of a physician, cluttered with jars of dried plants, astrological charts pinned to the walls, and half-burnt candles dripping onto grimy tables. After the Black Death, medicine was forced to rethink itself. The old explanations, bad humours, divine wrath, poisoned air, suddenly seemed flimsy when they failed so spectacularly. You watch survivors grope for new answers, balancing on the thin line between superstition and science. Historically, the plague was a hammer blow to medieval medicine. Traditional physicians leaned on Galen and Aristotle, insisting that imbalance in the four humours caused illness, but their remedies, bloodletting, purging, endless syrups, had done little. Survivors didn't forget that failure. Some physicians began questioning old authorities, experimenting with observation and trial. In Italy, scholars like Guy de Chauliac recorded detailed notes of symptoms and survival rates, shaping early epidemiology. In Montpellier and Padua, universities revised curricula to include more practical anatomy and botany. The plague didn't cure medicine's flaws, but it jolted it toward change. Here's the quirky fact. One French town hired an official sniffer whose job was to detect plague by smell. He claimed he could identify the sickness by its odour before symptoms appeared. Whether he was a fraud or simply had a strong nose, the post made him both respected and feared. Imagine your reputation hinging on how accurately you can say, "Yes, that peasant smells like death." The scholarly debate asks whether the Black Death really marked a turning point, or just nudged medicine along a pre-existing track. Some argue it accelerated empirical study by forcing doctors to record, compare, and adapt instead of blindly quoting ancient texts. Others counter that superstition remained dominant. Astrology, charms, and bloodletting persisted well into the 15th century. Was the plague a medical revolution, or just another stumble toward one? The answer, like a physician's diagnosis, depends on which case you study. For you, seated in the corner of this workshop, the mix is striking. On one shelf sit jars of dried sage and rosemary, believed to cleanse the air. On another rests a dissected pig, its organs carefully labelled as stand-ins for human anatomy. The physician scratches notes furiously, glancing between his patient and the heavens, as if equally convinced by observation and the stars. A mother waits anxiously while he prescribes both a poultice of ground herbs and a prayer to St. Roch, hedging bets with both science and sanctity. And medicine isn't confined to physicians. Midwives, herbalists, and even gravediggers continue to shape local practice. A village woman sells charms woven from garlic and nettles, swearing they repel pestilence. Another boils willow bark for fevers, her remedies quietly effective even if dismissed by scholars. In the cracks of official medicine, folk knowledge thrives, passed along in whispers and recipes. By nightfall, you walk past a line of patients waiting at the physician's door. Some hold coins, others barter with chickens or cloth. They don't care whether his cures come from Galen, herbs, or the constellations. They care that he's alive, present, and trying. In a world where answers dissolved alongside the old order, medicine is less about certainty than persistence. Every herb mixed, every chart drawn, every experiment scribbled is a declaration. We're not giving up on life just yet. The physician's cluttered workshop fades behind you, and soon you're standing in the echoing hall of a council chamber. The air is heavy with parchment, wax seals, and the faint stink of too many men sweating under woolen cloaks. The plague has left not just fields and homes in ruins, but also laws. With half the population gone, rulers scramble to rewrite the rules that once kept feudal Europe glued together. Statutes, decrees, ordinances. Everywhere you look, the ink is still drying. You can practically hear the sound of authority trying to reassert itself through scribbled words. Historically, the most famous example was England's Statute of Labourers in 1351, a desperate attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and stop workers from wandering off for better deals. Similar laws appeared across Europe, restricting peasants' movement, inheritance rights, and wages. Monarchs and city councils worried not just about economics, but about losing control. The plague cracked open possibilities, and governments rushed to slam the door shut again. Here's the quirky fact. In Milan, officials passed laws about how many mourners could attend a funeral, not because they cared about grief, but because they worried funerals were turning into rowdy social gatherings. One chronicler grumbles that widows dressed too gaily at processions, catching new husbands before the old bodies had cooled. So the council decided to legislate mourning, as if sorrow could be neatly filed alongside taxes. The scholarly debate asks whether these new laws were actually effective or just wishful thinking. Some argue they tightened social order, proving that governments still had teeth even after catastrophe. Others insist most people ignored them. Peasants laughed at wage caps, workers still wandered, and families bent inheritance rules to their advantage. Were these laws a genuine reshaping of society, or simply paper shields waved by desperate rulers? Historians remain divided, pointing to evidence of both enforcement and defiance. For you, watching the council at work, the tension is obvious. One scribe reads aloud a decree demanding that no man may demand wages above his station. A farmer in the back mutters that he'll ignore it. Fields won't plough themselves and lords will pay when desperate. Another decree bans inheritance disputes without the bishop's approval, but outside, widows are already fighting tooth and nail over property. Legal parchment be damned. The ink dries faster than obedience. Yet not all the laws are futile. You hear about new ordinances requiring towns to clean streets more regularly, to burn waste, to keep butchers outside city walls. These measures, though crude, lay the groundwork for future public health policy. Some statutes reorganise trade routes, rebuild bridges, and regulate grain prices. It's messy, inconsistent, but it shows a society trying to learn from catastrophe rather than simply collapse under it. By the time the council session ends, the chamber smells of extinguished candles and stale promises. The lords and clerks shuffle out, robes trailing, while peasants outside jostle to see what new burdens or opportunities have just been proclaimed. You realise that laws, like walls, aren't just about control, they're about reassurance. They tell survivors that someone somewhere still holds the pen of order. Whether anyone listens is another matter entirely. You step out of the council chamber expecting calm, but the streets outside buzz with something sharper. It's not the hum of markets or the chants of priests, it's anger. Men and women gather in clusters, their voices rising above the clatter of hooves. Pitchforks lean against walls, scythes rest on shoulders, and the look in their eyes is a mix of exhaustion and fury. The new laws tried to press survivors back into their old roles, but many have tasted leverage and refused to let it go. You realise you're standing at the edge of a peasant uprising. Historically, the decades after the Black Death were marked by waves of revolt. In 1358, the French countryside erupted in the Jacquerie, where peasants burned manors and slaughtered nobles in revenge for exploitation. In 1381, England saw the peasants' revolt, led by Wat Tyler, demanding fair wages, lower taxes, and an end to serfdom. Similar rebellions flared in Italy, Flanders, and Germany. The plague had thinned the ranks of authority, and survivors recognised the imbalance. For once, they had numbers on their side, and their anger carried the heat of generations. Here's the quirky fact. During the English Revolt, rebels stormed into London and actually sat on the King's throne in the Tower, laughing and feasting before torching records of feudal obligations. Imagine peasants, mud still on their boots, lounging in the royal seat while clerks panicked around them. For a fleeting moment, the old hierarchy was literally upside down. Scholars argue about the true roots of these uprisings. Were they born directly out of plague trauma, or were they more about long-simmering resentment over taxes, war, and feudal restrictions? Some say the Black Death was the spark that lit a pre-prepared pile of dry wood. Others insist it fundamentally changed class relations, emboldening peasants with the knowledge that society couldn't function without them. Either way, the revolt showed that Europe's social order was shakier than it had ever admitted. You walk among the rebels now. Their voices rise in chants, not polished or poetic, but raw. We will not starve. We will not kneel. An old man brandishes a hoe like a sword, while a boy clutches a stolen helmet that's far too big for him. Women march beside them, some carrying baskets of stones, others pulling carts of bread to feed the crowd. This isn't just a riot, it's a movement fueled by grief, hunger, and the intoxicating taste of possibility. The authorities, of course, panic. Troops assemble, banners rise, and rumours swirl that knights are already riding out to teach the peasants their place. The town around you trembles with tension. Shutters bang shut, priests whisper prayers, and merchants hide their coin chests. You can feel the air before the storm, charged and brittle. When the clash finally comes, it's brutal. The rebels surge with anger, overwhelming guards, torching a manor, ripping ledgers from Clark's hands. But soon armoured knights crash into the crowd, steel against wood, discipline against desperation. Screams split the air. A boy who just hours ago wore a stolen helmet now lies trampled in the mud. The revolt burns bright, then flickers under the weight of swords. By nightfall, the square is quiet again, but the silence feels different from the early days of the plague. It's not resignation, it's simmering. Even crushed, the memory of rebellion lingers. Survivors have learned that authority can be challenged, even if victory slips away. In the ashes of this uprising, you sense the faint pulse of something enduring. The idea that peasants were no longer faceless labour, but a force that rulers would never again fully ignore. The mud of revolt still clings to your boots as you wander back into the quieter edges of town. The shouting crowds are gone, but in their place is a subtler hum. Whispers of charms, the clink of amulets, and the rustle of parchment covered in star charts. For all the new laws, new wages, and new rebellions, the plague left behind one stubborn habit: people clinging to strange remedies. If medicine was still fumbling in the dark, then why not try garlic necklaces, crystal spheres, or prayers to the alignment of Jupiter and Mars? You find yourself in a world where reason and superstition sit side by side, bickering like siblings. Historically, the years after the Black Death saw a surge in alternative cures. Amulets filled with dried herbs dangled from children's necks. Astrologers claimed to predict outbreaks by charting the heavens, while alchemists hawked potions promising protection. Some towns even employed wise women, or local charm makers, who prescribed remedies involving everything from frog parts to recited chants. The church frowned, but desperation outweighed doctrine. Survivors would try anything if it meant keeping death away. Here's the quirky fact. One popular charm involved carrying a dead toad around in a pouch, the logic being that the toad would suck out the poison of the plague. People swore by it, though the only thing it probably produced was an awful smell. Another cure advised drinking one's own urine, justified by the idea that what left the body could rebalance it. Imagine a family gathered at dinner, half joking, half serious, debating whether to toast with wine or something less pleasant. The scholarly debate here asks whether these strange remedies were simply foolishness, or whether they represent a deeper kind of proto-science. Some argue that charms and astrology were pure superstition, distractions from real cures. Others note that many remedies involved herbal mixtures that may have had mild antiseptic or pain-relieving effects. Astrology, too, wasn't just hocus-pocus. It was a framework for organising data, however flawed. Were these survivors gullible, or were they experimenting in the only language they had? The line is blurry. You duck into a dim shop where shelves sag with jars of dried plants, stones etched with symbols, and scrolls of planetary charts. The shopkeeper, a woman with sharp eyes, offers you a sachet of rue and wormwood, guaranteed to ward off bad air. On the counter lies a brass astrolabe gleaming in the candlelight. She traces the stars with her finger, murmuring predictions about the next season. Outside, a man ties a talisman of chicken bones to his child's wrist, muttering prayers under his breath. And yet you notice something. These practices aren't always in opposition to medicine or faith. They overlap. A physician prescribes a poultice and a charm. A priest blesses relics while villagers still whisper about astrology. Survivors don't care about categories. They care about survival. If one thing fails, they'll stack another on top, until the ritual itself feels protective. By nightfall, you sit by a hearth, while villagers pass around a charm said to have belonged to a saint. Each person touches it, eyes closed, as if drawing strength from its surface. Is it placebo? Is it hope? Maybe it doesn't matter. After so much death, belief itself has become a medicine, fragile but stubborn. And as the fire crackles, you realise that in a world still groping for answers, strange remedies are less about curing the body than about soothing the mind, reminding survivors that they still have some sliver of control over the chaos. The faint scent of herbs and toad charms lingers as you leave the hearth, but soon your path takes you somewhere entirely different. A small green where children chase one another in the fading light. Their laughter feels almost jarring after the dirges, riots and funerals you've witnessed. This is the next generation, the children of the plague, growing up in a world reshaped by loss, but also strangely full of opportunity. Their voices are higher, their knees perpetually scraped, but their futures stretch wide in directions their parents could barely imagine. Historically, the demographics after the Black Death created what some scholars call a youthquake. With so many adults gone, children inherited wealth, land and responsibilities far earlier than before. In England, records show minors inheriting entire manors, their guardians scrambling to manage estates until they came of age. Apprenticeships opened faster, guild ladders shortened, and the path to adulthood accelerated. For some, tragedy created opportunity. For others, it meant carrying burdens too heavy for small shoulders. Here's the quirky fact. Because labour was scarce, even children were courted by employers. Chroniclers grumble that boys of 12 strutted about demanding wages like seasoned journeymen, while girls barely in their teens were hired as domestic servants, with pay higher than their mothers once earned. Imagine preteens swaggering through the marketplace, boasting about their contracts, while adults muttered about how the world had turned upside down. The scholarly debate revolves around what kind of legacy these plague-born children carried into adulthood. Some historians argue they were bolder, freer, less tied to tradition, having grown up in a society where rules bent or broke daily. Others warn that trauma lingered deeply. Orphans raised without stability, haunted by memories of death carts and empty houses, may have carried scars into their choices. Were these children the seeds of renewal, or a generation burdened by loss? The evidence points in both directions. You pause to watch a group of children play. They've invented a game that mimics a funeral procession, complete with one child pretending to be a skeleton chasing the others. It's macabre, but the laughter is real, as though they've transformed horror into play. Down the road, another group practices juggling apples, inspired by the travelling performers who came through at the last festival. Their world is a collage of death and rebirth, grief and joy stitched together in games. At home, you see the weight of inheritance. A boy barely 15 sits with a steward, signing documents that make him lord of a manor. He looks both terrified and proud, quill wobbling in his hand. In another house, a girl balances her baby brother on one hip while bargaining with a neighbour over grain. Childhood, in the modern sense, barely exists. Survival demands speed, and the children rise to it with unsettling ease. By evening, the village green is alive with youthful energy. Fires flicker, shadows stretch, and the children still play, their voices piercing the darkness like bells. You realise that this generation doesn't remember the before in the same way. Their memories are forged in aftermath, not collapse. They are not just surviving in the ruins, they are normalising them, turning plague-pocked streets into playgrounds, making tomorrow feel less haunted. And though their games may mimic death, their laughter insists on life, echoing long after the sun dips below the horizon. The laughter of children fades behind you, and as you walk onward, something shifts in the air. The grief, the anger, the bargaining, the ghosts, all of it begins to weave into something larger. It's not a single event, not a sudden change, but a slow rising tide. In the wake of catastrophe, survivors are planting seeds that will sprout into a new era. The Black Death tore medieval Europe apart, but from its ruins rises a strange, uneven momentum that historians would later call the Renaissance. And you, wandering these streets, can feel its pulse quickening beneath your feet. Historically, the decades after the plague did not glitter overnight. Many towns still lay abandoned, fields still wild, and fear of recurrence lingered. Yet signs of renewal shimmered everywhere. Universities, battered but alive, began experimenting with broader curricula, including mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. Wealthy merchants, flush with inherited fortunes, poured money into chapels, art, and libraries. Even city governments commissioned public works, from hospitals to town halls, both as symbols of resilience and as genuine attempts to improve civic life. Here's the quirky fact. Some Italian city-states funded their rebuilding with lotteries. Yes, medieval scratch-offs. Citizens bought tickets, the winners pocketed prizes, and the surplus went toward financing new walls, bridges, and public fountains. Imagine buying a slip of parchment that could either get you a barrel of wine or help pave the road outside your house. It sounds absurdly modern, but it worked. The scholarly debate, of course, asks the big question: did the Black Death cause the Renaissance or merely speed it along? Some historians argue the plague created so much social, economic, and cultural upheaval that innovation was inevitable. With labour scarcity came higher wages, with inheritance came new wealth, with disillusionment came new questions about faith, knowledge, and art. Others caution against oversimplification, noting that Italian city-states were already rich and inventive before the plague. The catastrophe may have delayed as much as it accelerated. The Renaissance, in this view, wasn't born from death. It simply grew despite it. For you, though, the signs are undeniable. In one workshop, an artist experiments with perspective, sketching a street that seems to stretch deeper into the page. In another, a young scholar pores over a newly translated manuscript of Aristotle, arguing with his teacher about whether observation might matter more than authority. Merchants haggle not just over cloth and spices, but over pigments for painters, marble for sculptors, and glass for churches. Creativity hums beneath the marketplace noise, a restless current refusing to be quieted. You wander into a new hospital, its corridors smelling of vinegar and herbs. It's far from modern, but it represents something revolutionary, an institutional attempt at organised care. Across town, a library opens its doors, scrolls and codices stacked for scholars and curious citizens alike. And in the square, a public fountain gushes with clean water, financed by the very council that once tried to freeze wages. Everywhere you look, the remnants of fear are being rebuilt into structures of possibility. As the sun sinks, you climb a hill overlooking the city. Below you see walls patched with fresh stone, markets bustling with caravans, children darting between stalls, and artists painting skeletons dancing alongside saints. It's messy, contradictory and haunted, but alive. Out of millions of deaths, life has clawed its way back, louder and brighter. The plague left scars that never fully healed, but it also cracked the world open, letting in light that had been shuttered for centuries. You stand there, listening to the mingled sounds of hammers, laughter, prayers and song, and you realise this isn't just recovery, it's transformation. The survivors didn't rebuild what was lost, they built something new, fragile yet fierce, stitched together with memory, defiance and hope. And though they don't know the word for it yet, you do. Renaissance. And that, friends, is where our journey through plague-shadowed Europe winds down. We've walked through silent streets, past pits of lime and bones, across fields gone wild, and into halls where laws, wages and whispers reshaped society. We've watched peasants bargain with lords, women step into power, children turn death into play, and artists paint skeletons into eternal dances. It was messy, chaotic, often brutal. But out of that chaos, something entirely new took root. The story of the Black Death is not just about death. It's about what comes after. Survivors were not passive figures waiting for history to carry them. They were builders, rebels, jokers, mourners, and dreamers. They carried scars, yes, but also tools, brushes, songs, and stubborn hope. They rebuilt not the world that had collapsed, but the world they needed next. And in doing so, they set in motion currents that would ripple through centuries, shaping the very foundations of the modern age. As you sit back now, think about that strange rhythm of survival. Grief, then rebuilding. Fear, then laughter. Collapse, then creation. It's a pattern as old as humanity itself. We are fragile, endlessly so, but we're also endlessly resourceful. When the ground cracks, we plant seeds in the fissures. When silence falls, we sing louder. When walls collapse, we build new ones, sometimes sturdier, sometimes stranger, but always with the same defiant pulse of life. So, as you drift into sleep, let that hum of resilience settle around you like a blanket. Picture the markets glowing with new cloth, the walls rising from rubble, the music echoing under torches, and the children laughing in fields once abandoned. Out of ruin, life insists on returning. Out of death, history insists on continuing. and out of silence we always find a song